All right, exactly what powers does the President of the United States have? What can the President do and what can't the President do based on the Constitution? Can the President do that? Can't the President do that? How do we know? Well, as per usual, this is one of those things that has a whole lot of opinion attached to it, and I'm going to try to avoid all of that. But I'm going to take you through some of the history that has defined this discussion over time and explain some of the frameworks that the Supreme Court has used over the years to determine the answer to this question. I'm Brian. I make videos about law and civics. Please share, comment, repost, do all the stuff to get this video out there so people will see it. This is really important stuff. You deserve to understand your own government and law. So come along with me. We'll learn something together. It'll be fun. Sort of fun. Okay, let's do this. It's probably not a huge surprise that the president's power is defined in the U.S. Constitution. So let's start there. Article 1, Legislature, Congress. Article 3, that's Supreme Court. Back to Article 2. The President. Now, some of the powers of the presidency are defined in detail here in the Constitution in Article 2. The President is the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy. The President has the power to pardon people. The President deals with foreign diplomats and stuff like that. The President has the power to veto. And the President has the power to sign treaties. There's a bunch of powers enumerated here in Article 2. We're not talking about the powers that are enumerated here in Article 2. Those are not up for debate. The question really comes down to the first sentence of Article 2, and it's a really simple sentence. That sentence says, "The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America." Simple, right? So why does this sentence create so many problems? I'll break it down. This sentence has been read to mean two different things. First, the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States. But does the executive power mean the powers listed later on? Or does it mean the executive power? Like we all know what executive power means, the power of the executive. You know, everybody knows what the executive power means. So the question has been for many years, does the executive power imply some set of powers that the president has that aren't listed later in the article? And is that what's meant by this sentence? Or, reading number 2, the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. And the argument there is that when they were deciding whether to have one president or multiple executives, they decided to have the executive power be vested in one President of the United States of America. And that's what that sentence is saying. Well, you'd think this would be an easy question to answer. We'll just look back to see what they were saying back in the 1790s, right? Well, guess what? Those two arguments come from James Madison and Alexander Hamilton in 1793. Alexander Hamilton felt that the executive power was sort of like an imaginary group of powers. James Madison said, no, we were talking about multiple executives and we were clarifying there was only going to be one executive. And remember, Madison and Hamilton wrote the Federalist Papers together, and Federalist number 70, written by Alexander Hamilton, Advantages of a Single Executive. So Madison may have had a point when he said that they were arguing over whether to have one or multiple executives, and that was the point of the sentence. Point is, we've been arguing about this since 1793. Fortunately or unfortunately, in 1953, we got an answer that is sort of the best and the worst answer we could ever ask for. Let me explain. In 1953, the Supreme Court gave us the opinion in Youngstown Tube v. Sawyer, which is kind of a hilarious name. Now, in Youngstown Tube, President Truman had just issued Executive Order 10340 because the Steelworkers Union was hours away from beginning a nationwide strike. And this being wartime, President Truman was worried about the impact that strike would have on the United States. So he issued this directive to the Secretary of Commerce to take control of all steel mills in the country and keep them operating in the name of national defense. Now, 6 out of 9 Supreme Court justices agreed that his executive order was unconstitutional, but they did not seem to be able to agree on why. So the downside of this opinion is that it really doesn't give us a single answer to what the president's authority means. The upside is that it gives us 4 answers, all in one case. And those 4 answers have turned out to sort of be the 4 answers that we've used for everything since. So if you read this one case and learn these 4 tests, you'll sort of know all of the tests that are basically used going forward. And one in particular is kind of the most popular. So I'm going to break these down for you. So test number 1 is Justice Black's opinion. It's kind of the main opinion for the court, and it says no, there is no inherent power. Justice Black says we have a written constitution that establishes a limited government, and the idea of there being some inherent power given to the executive branch is completely inconsistent with that idea. So there is no extra power given to the president that is not written down. So Justice Black's test is, for the president's order to be valid, it has to stem from either an act of Congress or from the Constitution itself. If it doesn't come from one of those two places, then the order is invalid. So that's Justice Black. Test number 1. Test number 2 is Justice Douglas, and he's a little bit more squishy. This test is called interstitial executive power, or as I call it, squishy. And the general idea of this test seems to be like, yeah, we have our written down powers, our enumerated powers, but they also imply some powers. And as long as they don't get anywhere near Congress's or the Supreme Court's powers, we're fine. So basically, there is a need for the president to exercise some powers that are not specifically enumerated. So for example, the president is given the right to appoint people into certain jobs, but nowhere in the Constitution does it give him the right to remove people from those jobs. And we imply the fact that he can remove those people once he's appointed them. So the test here is that the order stands as long as the president is not usurping any of Congress or the Supreme Court's powers or hindering them in any way from doing their jobs. But based on the examples, it's also sort of a stay in your lane kind of thing. I like to think of it as you have your enumerated powers and they're a little squishy. So that's test number 2, interstitial, squishy, whatever you want to call it. Test number 3 is called legislative accountability. Justice Jackson's concurring opinion is really the famous one. He gives us a 3-part test that is applied in most cases where we ask this question. And the question basically asks, has Congress weighed in on this? How did they weigh in? And then it sets out responses depending on what Congress has said. Either Congress expressly or impliedly gave the president permission to do this action, Congress was silent on whether or not the president had permission to do this action, or Congress express or impliedly forbade the president from doing this action. So it's one of those 3 levels. At level 1, if the president is granted authority to do this, that's the president's strongest level to be in, and the Supreme Court should read this as presumptively constitutional. It's a higher burden for them to get over. They have to prove that it was unconstitutional. If Congress was silent on the issue, then we enter what the judge refers to as the zone of twilight, which is very poetic and unnecessarily so. And basically means that the Supreme Court needs to sit down with the facts and figure it out for themselves. And that's the answer. The answer is the Supreme Court needs to hash it out. And if Congress has expressed or implied that the president cannot do that action, then the president is in his weakest position, and the action is presumed to be unconstitutional unless the congressional order itself was unconstitutional. If the congressional order was unconstitutional, then they have to rethink it. But if the congressional order was constitutional, then the presidential order is unconstitutional. Now, as with all Supreme Court tests, none of these are locked in stone. They're just supposed to lead future judges along the path. Now, the final interesting opinion that we listened to in this case is Justice Vinton, who was the dissenting opinion. He said that the idea that specific powers needed to be enumerated was true for internal use of those powers, but when it came to external use of those powers, foreign use of those powers, they needed to be read more broadly. Because he said the power of an executive to deal with foreign affairs did not come from the Constitution, but was intrinsic to the job. So, these are the 4 reads on executive power. 1, only what's enumerated in the Constitution. 2, fuzzy squishy. 3, the 3-part test. And 4, maybe a little tighter inside the country, but outside of the country, way broader. So every time you think about an executive action, consider these 4 different reads and whether they fit into the enumerated powers in Article 2 of the Constitution. What does executive power mean? Was Alexander Hamilton right? Did that first sentence mean the executive power in a way that we all just understand what an executive does? I don't fully understand what an executive does, but maybe he did. He was involved in writing the thing, I wasn't. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Thanks again to all the people who've been supporting me. It's really helpful. You guys are keeping me fed, buying me coffees, sending me stuff on Venmo, buying me stuff on off my Amazon list. It's all on Linktree. Thank you very, very much. And if you keep watching these things, I'll keep making them. Thanks a lot, guys.